Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tim Fuchs with the National Council on Independent Living, and I want to welcome you all back to Part 4 of our ABCs of Nursing Home Transition series. Today's call is After the Move, Community Support. This webinar series is presented by the New Community Opportunities, a national training and technical assistance program of ILRU, the Independent Living Research Utilization Program in Houston, Texas. And this webinar was organized and facilitated by the National Council on Independent Living. Support for the presentation was provided by the U.S. Department of Education, RSA. No official endorsement of the Department of Education should be inferred. And of course, I want to welcome back Bruce Darling today. Thanks for being with us, Bruce. The call is yours.
Okay, great. Moving to slide 3, or actually 4. And so the person's transitioned into the community. So we're done, right? Well, actually not so much. In fact, the institutional bias still exists. And when I'm talking about the institutional bias, I'm not talking just about the institutional bias in funding streams that sends money to the institution and leaves community-based services optional, but that attitude as well, that there are people who belong in nursing facilities, or that they need to be there, so that those who come out of nursing facilities who we've assisted in transitioning are at significant risk of, quote, being put back where they belong. So we want to make sure that we're working with folks to maintain and support their independence. Moving to the next slide, 5, we will review. I'm going to look at today's webinar talking about the post-transition responsibilities that we have, what activities we might do or issues we might address in each of the components of the plan. And then we'll have a Q&A at that point, and then we'll go into common post-transition issues or concerns and a little more of a review about the specific checklists that are available. Moving on to slide 6. So we want to start with our post-transition responsibilities, and the first place is maintaining contact based on the individual's needs and preferences. Now, when we're talking about maintaining contact, I'm not suggesting that we should be checking up on the person. It shouldn't ever seem like that's what we're doing. In fact, we're maintaining contact and following up with them. So it can be a very casual, just checking in, making sure that the services and supports that they have are there. And the amount of support that someone may need may vary pretty dramatically, but whether or not you've identified that they need support, it's still a good idea to check in. Some of the things that we're going to have are questions about the stress and frustration of what's going on. So some people, it'd be important to provide empathy for folks, be aware of these emotional challenges and help folks prepare for that, and then assist them to looking into the future. So moving on to slide 7, the next slide, getting folks involved. One of the things that we can do is really get individuals involved in our Center for Independent Living and the local disability rights community. We talked a lot about moving people from the institution into the community. Well, building that sense, some people may need some more support in building that sense of community, and given the fact that we've been doing a lot of this transition work from a rights perspective, getting people involved makes a lot of sense. One of the favorite people and stories I have is we had worked quite a long time in assisting a woman named Helen getting out of the nursing facility, and it was a pretty complicated transition. I learned a lot in the process. She was a lot of fun to work with, and she actually went from, she was in the nursing facility, and a week later we had an adapt trip to Washington, D.C., and, asked Helen if she wanted to join us, and she came with us. And what was neat was her perspective at the end of the week. She said, she pointed out how the week before she had been in a nursing facility, and this week she had been handcuffed to the White House fence, had engaged in direct action. She was at a party drinking a beer, and as she put it, the gentleman across the way was looking at her as if she was Thanksgiving dinner. She was really excited about being in the community. It was important to her, but being engaged in the movement was an important piece of the transition. Folks can also get involved in providing peer support to others. I think one of the best examples of that was a guy we assisted. His name is Bobby. think skater dude who used a wheelchair, lots of metal in his face, jewelry. So he was, an interesting. He had a very significant disability and a very good attitude about, living and, wanting to be out and be free. And one of the things that he did was made it a point that he wanted to be involved in supporting others because he knew a bunch of 20-somethings who were in the local nursing facility who he thought could easily get out. So he became one of the folks, and he's still working with us in terms of providing peer support to folks making the transition. The person who you've assisted in transitioning also has a unique perspective that should be heard by policymakers. So when you're commenting on the consolidated planning process for housing or the state's Olmstead planning process that support people living in the most integrated setting or advocating that there be a planning process, it's important to bring folks into that discussion because they do have a very unique perspective. They've been there, done that. They know what the barriers are to community living and can talk about that firsthand. One of the other benefits of that is by focusing on the issues as these barriers that are out in the community that force people into institutions, we're reinforcing with the person that the problem is these things outside and the problem isn't them, so that when they're running into issues where they may be potentially pushed back toward institutionalization, they can see that more readily as discrimination and are more able to become involved in fighting back on that and will contact you. Moving on to slide 8, documenting your success. One of the things that I talk about is using the stories about transition as part of your center's annual report. These stories answer the question, what do you do? Which a lot of people say, independent living, what is that? What do you do? It answers that question in a very specific way, and they're concretely, and they're very compelling stories. So if people aren't really clear about what we do, these are great examples of that. And what happens is because it's the full range of supports and services that a person may need, it really shows us the breadth of issues that we deal with. Additionally, in New York, the New York State Centers have been tracking the savings associated with our transition work. Now, there are those in New York who will acknowledge that I have sometimes not so pleasant things to say about the State Education Department, but in this case, I really want to give a nod to them and the folks in the independent living unit there, because what they've done is they've developed a tracking form that allows centers to document these savings and to put that information out from the government that shows how we can actually be promoting community living and saving. Moving on to the next slide, post-transition support and advocacy. This is a critical function. It's extremely important. What we want to do is review and modify the independent living plan as needed. Now, at this point in the process, you should know the person. So, reviewing the plan can be really informal. You may, when you're first starting, want to do this in a more formal way, but the process is more about the person, not the paper. Now, in some cases, you might be using Medicaid money or other dollars that have paperwork requirements associated with them in terms of providing ongoing support. It would be important to follow the regulations related to that. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I just want to make sure that you understand that the process here is more about the person and listening to what's going on with them. We want to assist them in making sure that their needs are met and advocate on their behalf. Some of the things that you want to look at is knowing what originally got the person into the nursing facility can be a good indication of the things that you may want to look at as you move forward with that individual. There may be things to watch for. So if there were problems around housing or finances or personal assistance, those would be the potential areas that you're most likely to run into difficulties later on. And basically that's because where you've got gaps in the system in your state, the gaps that were there before are most likely still there now, and the person's going to run into those. So it's important to keep an eye to that and to recognize other potential things that a person might need. In the following slides, what I'm going to talk about are sort of next steps related to the components of each transition. So as we move to slide 10, we'll look at housing. So the things that we want to look at is the housing continued to be appropriate to the individual's needs? Have the modifications been completed, and do they meet the person's needs? Are there additional modifications that are still needed? Yes, we actually have transitioned folks with modifications not completely done or in process. It's important to, in terms of the availability of the housing and the services, it was important to make the move before everything was in place. That's absolutely an approach you can use, but you want to make sure and follow up and that those things actually happen. Is the rent being paid? Has the rental assistance and subsidies been obtained? And are those working as expected? Because there are always glitches. Moving on to slide 11, if there is a roommate, is that working out? We can actually find that I'm one of these people who doesn't necessarily live well with others. So you could have a rub related to disagreements between roommates. It's important to have a sense of how the lease works and to keep an eye on that, because if the situation is set up that people are paying jointly for the housing, that may, if someone moved out, the person who's left behind may have some real serious financial issues. Are there additional furnishings that are needed or landlord issues that might need resolution? Moving on to slide 12, personal assistance services. Now, if the individual has personal assistance, how is this working out? Are the hours of assistance sufficient? Are the person's needs being met? Is the person able to provide adequate direction to the personal assistance? And does the individual need assistance, additional information on how to effectively manage the personal assistance services? And that would apply for both traditional and consumer-directed services. We might find specific issues related to an individual attendant. So you might have everything may be smooth except there's a problem where a particular attendant isn't necessarily meeting their goals or doing what they need to do, or there may be a problem there. You may have a problem with the home care agency as a whole. The agency may be trying to pull out or refuse to meet a person's needs, and you can also run into problems related to the level of care determination for folks on waiver services. So what you might find is a year out the person is being reassessed, and although they have been in a nursing facility for a decade or more, suddenly they've been determined not to require nursing facility level of care, and that could render them ineligible for waiver services in the community. So these are all the kinds of things that we would want to look for. On slide 13, assistive technology. Did the individual receive the assistive technology devices specified in the plan? Are they working? Is there a plan for them to be serviced if needed? Is there additional technology that might further support the individual in living independently? For us, it's often the broken down door opener or wheelchair that are the kinds of things that we're dealing with. There may be other assistive technology that we've used or adaptations that break down. Just checking to make sure that those are in place and they're still working is really important. Slide 14, healthcare. Have all the medical needs addressed by the plan been addressed? Are healthcare appointments being made and kept? And is the durable equipment, medical equipment working and effective? This one's particularly important because the community doctor on board with the plan? Does the community doctor have concerns or issues that they feel need to be addressed as part of the person's living independently? And this one's particularly important because as far as when you talk about Olmstead and a person's right to live in the most integrated setting, the court decision talked about the treating professional. And although I would have a different opinion on it, a lot of times folks look to the medical doctor as the treating professional in this case. So if there are potential issues that the doctor has, it's important to make sure that those are addressed, whether it's changes in the plan or educating the doctor, which, you can go both directions on this, but making sure that the doctor is on board with the plan is extraordinarily important. So moving on to slide 15, how is the mental health services and supports? How is the person handling the stress of the transition? Are there mental health needs that should be addressed? So is the stress from the transition creating issues? Does the individual acknowledge these and want assistance? And how would the individual prefer to have those handled? Looking at slide 16, conversely, being in an institution can actually cause mental health issues. One of the things that my husband actually does, I have to practice saying that, work in facilities providing counseling to folks. And one of the nursing facilities contacted him and said, Joe seems depressed. And he said, well, he's locked up. That would be normal. So potentially you have, when people are moving out into the community and gaining control of their life, some of their situation may actually improve. So we want to watch for that. And it may mean that they don't need medications to alter their mood, or there may be a change in treatment. Is the person having any issues with post-traumatic stress? I tossed this in here and didn't really have a clear sense of this until I was working with a woman. And I was just sort of hanging out at her house. I don't even remember why I was there. I remember spending a lot of time talking about her litter box and the automated litter box, and we were trying to problem solve around that. But at some point, the home care nurse came in, and the entire situation changed. Her behavior changed. She seemed to be responding to things that I just didn't see going on. So, and then the nurse left, and she switched, things switched around. And I just casually raised the issue with her. It seemed like a lot of what she was talking about was her institutionalization, how she felt when she was in the developmental center. And just to put it in some context, we're in New York, and we had a dreadful developmental center called Willowbrook. The difference between where she was and Willowbrook was she didn't have Geraldo Rivera coming in through the front door and documenting, the trauma that she was going through. So she had all of the same horrific experiences that the folks in Willowbrook had, but none of the protections after the fact. And then I just sort of raised the issue with her to look at, and one of the things that, as we looked into post-traumatic stress, you could see was that she was using medication to alter her mood, and there were a number of things there that just by raising her awareness of the issues, it allowed her to focus on and deal with. Moving on to slide 17. Are there any services and supports needed relating to addiction? Does the individual acknowledge these, and what supports do they need or want? So the question is going to be: you've worked with someone, you've developed a plan with them. They had an addiction previously, and suddenly, they're drinking again. What do I do? Let's start with drinking. And we actually had this experience. We were working with a guy. We helped him transition into the community. He had been an alcoholic, was an alcoholic, had issues with alcohol anyway. And part of the plan was he talked about, not drinking and pursuing treatment. And then a few months out in the community, he said, he was spotted drinking. And all of a sudden I got a bunch of phone calls from people who were very stressed out saying, oh my God, he's drinking alcohol. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? And we said, well, you need to address this. I said, well, okay, first off, let's start with alcohol is not illegal. So, for me to just sort of run out to him and say, you've got to stop this seems, counter, it is not how I work with folks, and it's not he has control over his life. These are his choices. I think it's important, though, when you're looking at the potential for these, to be clear that we are not the police. So even when the issue is the person is using illegal drugs, I'm not in the position, because I'm just providing assistance with the transition. I am not responsible I'm not the police. I am not going to, pursue legal action against someone. I also don't put myself in a position where I'm required to enforce the plan. So if the issue is the home care agency accepted him on the condition that he wouldn't be using drugs or alcohol, that is between him and the home care agency. Now, I have a definite role here, and we're going to talk about that more in detail after the end of the first Q&A. I really want to focus on sort of what are the kinds of things you're going to run into at this point. But we'll go into this in more detail as to how do you address these issues. And addiction is a particularly problematic one for folks because there are a lot of attitudes and issues around this. So moving on to slide 18, who would think that transportation would be an easier issue? Is the plan meeting the individual's transportation needs? Is there accessible transportation available? Are they making use of it? And does the person need training in using the transportation system? These are all questions you want to look at. It may be that when you were developing the transition process, you didn't think as much about transportation, or it didn't seem like it was going to be as much of an issue. There may have been an informal support, and now suddenly you realize that you need more access to transportation. Then it becomes something you need to look at. You want to consider, is transportation or problems with accessing transportation creating problems with other parts of the plan? And that can go both directions as well. Not just the individual's access to transportation, but often attendants having access to transportation is an important part of the plan, so you want to consider that. Moving on to slide 19. Does the individual have volunteer activities? And is which is, if that was part of the plan, are they there? Is the individual interested in volunteering? And if so, are there supports or services that are needed to help the person make that happen? One of the most problematic things for us has been home care agencies. So we've had folks who wanted to go outside the home and do things just like everyone else, and they need to go to the bathroom during the day. I don't know. Seems like a very reasonable thing to me. And the home care agency, when presented with, well, you need to go to this place for assistance with the bathroom, it gets very upset. And they say, well, this is called home care because it's services that are provided in the home. Now, although they can say that, actually in the Second Circuit where we're located, there is an actual court decision that says home care services can be provided in the community, but I also think that there's just a standard here in terms of the person should be able to go to the bathroom wherever they are, and whether that's at a place whether that's at home or where they're volunteering. That's one of the things we might need to work on. Moving on to slide 20, education and employment. Does the individual want to be employed full-time, part-time? Does the individual have a job? If not, what efforts is the individual making to find employment? And are there other supports that are needed with the employment search? This is often a less likely an issue during the first 6 months, but it's something to keep an eye to, particularly if a person has some background, they want to go back to working. We've had folks who had very skilled jobs, who were younger people with significant disabilities, who had to give up working, and that was an important part of their life. So a big part of the transition plan was to work on this. Now, maybe they didn't immediately go back to work, but it was something that they wanted to do a little further out, and a significant number of folks who've transitioned have actually gone back to work. So moving on to slide 21, family and friends. Have family or friends been involved in the transition process? If they have, do they have any questions or concerns about the transition, particularly now that the individual is out? And if the family and friends provide support as a part of the plan, because a lot of times, they may be doing a piece. Maybe it's grocery shopping, personal assistance. They might be living together. And a lot of times, the government just wants to maximize the informal supports that are available. It may be that the family or the informal supports friends overcommitted in the process. They were very committed to the individual moving out into the community, and they were asked, can they do this? I use the term burnout. I don't like that as much because it implies, I prefer to say maybe they've overcommitted. But it is something you want to watch for and keep an eye to. And if the family does have concerns, you want to make sure that you address those up front. And what we've seen is, these can, in the extreme, we worked with a woman who the plan was that her partner would provide 24/7 services for her. And both of them had mental health disabilities. The one woman had the physical disability on top of that. And everyone was stunned when, after a number of years, the partner was unable to provide 24/7 assistance. I can't even imagine how someone would have come up with this plan. It was completely foreseeable whether or not you had a diagnosis at the start. But it really was poorly thought out, and essentially the government was taking advantage of this woman and her commitment to get her partner out into the community. So we want to keep an eye to that. Moving on to slide 22. Social, faith, and recreation. What recreation or social activities, hobbies is the individual participating in or would they like to be involved in? Particularly, the focus has been on sort of the nuts and bolts, getting out, making sure the personal assistance services are in place. And when that begins to settle in, the person's looking for something more. If you may have had some preliminary conversations about hobbies and things, but now is the time you're really going to see that the person, if that's not been a big part of the plan in the process previously, this may become more important. What supports the individual receiving for social, faith, recreation activities? Again, is the personal assistance available? Does the person need assistance with transportation? And if the individual chooses, are they involved in the religious activities? And is there any support necessary in making sure? Again, this could be something like, you've connected them back up with the faith community, and they're happy to come and visit the individual, but the church isn't accessible. Maybe at this point you can move to working to make sure that the person can become, either find another church that's accessible or work with the church, synagogue or wherever to be accessible so the person can come back to the services. Moving on to slide 23. Finances. You need to assist the consumer in paying the first month's bills. You may need to. And if you're not doing that, you want to check to make sure they're being paid on time. Not so much that I don't trust folks to do this. Well, if it were me, you definitely would need to check that. But sometimes if you're not in the habit of doing something, you just need to get that routine established, so it's helpful to help the person establish the routine. Does the budget meet the person's needs? Do you need to work with the person to adjust the budget? And that can be because maybe you didn't have a full sense of what was needed. You're planning, whether you're dealing with an individual budget or a big multi-million-dollar agency budget, you plan ahead. It's a plan. It doesn't necessarily work out that that's exactly how you spend your money. So acknowledging that, working with the individual to adjust to make sure things work for them. And again, the person may not have been as interested in or as willing to share specific information about the things that they want as part of their planning process. So, they may have been embarrassed that they are particularly into collecting things, or they're addicted to the TV channels where you can buy stuff. And I mean that I don't know. For those of us who buy things sort of on impulse, that acknowledge that and budget for it. They may not have been able to do that. They may not have thought about that in the nursing facility. So working with folks to adjust the budget accordingly. So moving on to slide 24. I'd like to open this up to questions. Again, at this point, what we've done is talked about the different components, the kinds of things that you're going to, you potentially have, you may address. We'll talk a bit more about how you address things in the next section.
First question comes from Barbara Elliott. Barbara, the floor is yours.
You need to set up a formal budget for the person doing the transition, or do you use a budget that is mainstream for everyone? And
okay, well,
adjusted according to the person's need.
Well, for me, I tend to, have those categories. I'm more, I think more globally, so I look to make sure that the global categories are covered. But I think the idea of having sort of a stock budget that there are some things that you're going to have in every budget. Money for food, wherever that comes from. So having that stock budget that you modify is a really good approach. So you just need to modify both ends of it, the income side and the expense. But that's a good way to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bruce, I don't have any questions on the web either, so we can go ahead.
Okay. So what I talked about earlier was when you're touching base with the individual, when you're doing that, you're maintaining contact and beginning to work with the individual. You want to do that informally, and you don't want to seem like you're checking up on the individual. Sometimes, you may need to do a little more checking up. So I'll use myself as an example. My assistant, Linda, after 3 times of me jumping in the car, running to the airport, and landing in another city, only to call her up and say, I don't have my meds. And us needing to do a lot of work with the doctor and getting all my meds prescribed at a local pharmacy. When that happened in Philadelphia, she just started to ask me, as I was on my way, I would call her and say, I'm on my way to the airport. And she'd chuckle and she'd say, do you have your meds? At that point, it was not, I'm checking on you. If she had done that initially in our first conversation, I might have felt a little upset by that. But having 3 times fallen into the situation, it really came across as more supportive. And I think that that's the tone we're looking for. We want to make sure that the person understands that we're being supportive. So as we're looking here at slide 25, some common post-transition issues. Okay, so the person who's transitioned may have some difficulty managing their personal assistance services. This is one that's going to be very common. And as I mentioned before, this is going to be both within the consumer-directed model where an individual may be managing, the scheduling and the bulk of their services. It also can be in traditional models of home care. Because even though the scheduling is handled, the attendant is at least theoretically supervised by a nurse, and you have all of these supports around the individual, the day-to-day of what needs to be done still comes down to the individual and the attendant. And if the person's been in the nursing facility and they've really, what they do is they promote the person being very passive within those settings. It's how they work. If everyone were managing their own services within the facility, I assume essentially some level of chaos would reign. So by definition, folks are very passive. You want to, and they may carry that over into the community. So it's important to watch for whether they're having some difficulty with managing their services. So it may be that the attendant is waiting for the person to say, hey, we should do this, and the person is thinking the attendant should be bringing these things up. So sort of having an eye on that. Is the person being taken advantage of by workers, attendants, or others, financially or otherwise? Is money missing? Another way that people sometimes get taken advantage of is that the attendants don't actually work the hours that they're scheduled and that they put on the timesheet. So these are areas where the individual may be taken advantage of, and we want to look for to watch for. The person may be threatened with reinstitutionalization. So that could be an area that where this is an issue. So that you may have someone who's taking advantage of the individual by overtly threatening that they're going to be institutionalized, or someone who just sort of alludes to it. So one of the things that we saw was some individuals who had been in the facility who had really bad experiences. They would be told things like, well, if you can't do this, you may need to go back in the nursing facility. And that was a very not so subtle, I think, way to manipulate their behavior and make them do things that they didn't necessarily want to do. Or that, made them more compliant to the provider sometimes. I think in this case, we want to be clear that sometimes a person may be taken advantage of, but it may not have started out maliciously. So maybe it was just initially the attendant said, can I leave 10 minutes early, and takes off, and they put it on the timesheet, and then that just sort of, that gets bigger and bigger over time. I'm not suggesting that that's the right thing to do with Medicaid fraud. I'm very clear that particularly if Medicaid's paying for it, it's Medicaid fraud. But I don't think that it started out with the intent. We've actually seen situations where folks have started out with good intentions and they started creating these little, well, you'll work these other, this is what's on the timesheet, we'll flex it in the future. We're very clear with folks that those kinds of deals don't work out really well. You can't keep track of them, and it gets out of hand pretty easily. But I don't want you to think that a person may necessarily, it would have started out as being malicious. Individuals may also be reluctant to seek medical care or hospitalization, particularly if that was how they were institutionalized in the first place. And this is a big one. I can't emphasize this enough because a lot of times folks ended up in the nursing facility because they went to the hospital. And that discharge planning process sent them right to the nursing facility. They thought they were going for rehab, but they ended up being stuck there. Yeah, you can't underestimate the fear that folks have related to going to the hospital. And we have I think a lot of these examples sort of pull together in one situation. We were working with a woman. I think it started out with an attendant just wanted to leave a little early, and she let that happen. And then eventually the attendants were really coming and going based on their interest as opposed to her needs. And, she was extraordinarily grateful for being in the community. She was, grateful to the attendants for being there, that she was glad that she wasn't in the nursing facility. This was a big thing to her. So she accepted things that she might not have, accepted otherwise. And the time that the attendants weren't there gradually increased pretty dramatically. So they were there. Coming to assist her was more infrequent than it should be. It was more infrequent than actually being there. And one day, she, although the situation was working not well, she fell out of bed because she needed some assistance, and she fell on her arm, and it pinned underneath her. Now, I want to be clear. She actually had a personal emergency response system. She had a button that she could push, and at any moment, she could get the assistance that people would come and assist her. But she was so scared that if they came and found her in the situation that she would go back to a nursing facility, she refused to push the button. She ended up laying on the floor, I think somewhere, it was not quite 24 hours, but a very long time with her arm pinned underneath her, which had to be incredible pain. But the fear of going back to a nursing facility was so intense that she would bear whatever physical pain she needed to deal with in order to avoid institutionalization. Now, what happens is the situation, an attendant comes in, the one who actually was coming in on schedule, I guess, and she sees the situation. EMTs are called. The woman goes to the hospital for very good reason. She was she was seriously injured in this. She, as part of it, ends up going back into the nursing facility, which was her exact fear, but wants to come back out. And we work with her in returning to the community. And when she goes to come back into the community, the county where we're located doesn't want to provide her with services. They said she's not, capable of managing her own services. And we advocated with them and said this was exactly, her fear of going in the facility was the problem. We would work with her on that. And we spent a lot of time, and she was very clear that in the event that you need to go to the hospital or go to the doctor, you need to do this. And we negotiated and got her out into the community again on services. So while she's out in the community, now the second time, she gets a basic flu or cold, something along those lines, needs to go to the emergency room. She goes to the emergency room to get treatment, and at that point, the county decides that they're going to take advantage of this opportunity and withdraw services from her and force her into the institution because they just didn't like the situation. And that was, we had a very strong discussion about this, let me tell you, because this was where the county was breaking the agreement with the individual. We had worked hard with her in good faith, saying, look, if you take your health seriously and you do this, we'll support you in the community. The county really didn't follow through on that. We were successful ultimately. But for the record, we did completely annoy the county, which did last year come back and bite us in the butt. Moving on to slide 26. Look for potential medical complications identified in the transition plan. We work with folks who have complex medical needs. It's important to just sort of sometimes where their health conditions are complex to list out the kinds of symptoms you should be looking for as part of the plan. So in one case, we were looking at aspiration pneumonia as being a potential problem because the guy had issues there. We had detailed lists in the plan to things to watch for so that the attendants could be trained, family knew what to look for, we knew what to look for. This is just a comprehensive approach. Is there a change in mental status or psychological status? Is the person more confused than normal? Are they more up or potentially more depressed, and that doesn't seem consistent? Is there a history here that we need to watch for? Has there been a change in their physical ability? Have they lost some physical ability that they previously had? Those would be things we would definitely want to watch for. Has there been a change in the cleanliness of the apartment or home? This can be the first sign that there are some attendant issues. So if an attendant is beginning to, become lax in what they're doing and maybe not showing up, the first thing that's going to go is the environmental stuff. So keeping an eye to that is important. And financial difficulties. Is the person missing money? If you're working with them and suddenly a bill's not being paid, that's something you really want to watch for. And they may be spending the money on something that's outside of the budget, or someone may be taking advantage of them. Moving on to slide 27. When we're working with the individual, we want to provide information and help and allow them to make an informed choice and have informed decision-making. So in this case, what I like to do is explain what the consequences are without being threatening. So the consequence should not be, if you do this, you'll go into a nursing facility. Try to explain, this is the home care agency, if this is a problem, the home care agency may want to withdraw services. We try to do this in a way that supports the individual. So one of the things, talking about like illegal drugs, maybe the issue isn't doing drugs gets you, or doing, smoking pot gets you in the nursing facility, but how you handle that. So smoking pot with your attendant, when the attendant's actually aware of the issue and the home care agency becomes aware, is really more of the critical issue that you're dealing with. And I'd like to share things with folks so that it sort of explains it in a way that doesn't directly affect them. So we've had situations where the attendant has been smoking, knows that you smoke pot, or the person smoked pot, and they have a disagreement, which is inevitable. You always have an issue with an employee. When they know stuff about you that you don't want them to know, it inevitably ends up in a place you don't want to hear. So you could actually have an attendant on their cell phone with the police, calling 911 from your driveway and screaming at the top of their lungs, I know where he keeps his pot. Real situation. Giving folks that kind of information to say, look, this is how this could go bad, it gives them some tools to look at how they make their decisions about what they're doing. I use the safety planning process that we talked about when we work with the individual. I think it's important to put the individual and maintain the individual being in charge of the process. So giving that information to the person about the home care agency has a responsibility, or the attendant may report you, even if it's they're agreeable to it down the line. If you have a disagreement, they may bring this up. It can be used against you. How do you want to handle that? There are a lot of different ways you can do that, but giving that person the information and not judging them. So I think it's important to not judge the individual, and I'm watching the PowerPoint pop around. Okay, so we want to be clear that we are available to assist the individual in the future as well. So both in terms of, if something comes up, maybe they've made a plan, made a decision that you personally don't agree with. Your position on that, your job is to support them down the road. So, and I think how you look at it is important as well. So as I talked about the guy who had some complex medical issues, one of the things that happened was after this transition, he had been in the hospital for 7 months. and we supported him in moving to the community. After he was at home for a few days, there was a significant change in mental status. There was a significant change in his physical ability. It was an acute health care crisis. He went back to the emergency room, and it wasn't in the just generic emergency room, was in the, back room emergency room that I had never been in. And the social worker from the hospital says to his wife, "I'm sorry the plan failed." And she was deeply distressed because, he was in the hospital, and she felt that she had failed him. And the doctor came by, and we were talking, and acknowledged that this was what she was feeling. And he said, I would like to just point out this was the plan. If there was a change in mental status or some physical crisis like this, a health crisis, the plan was to go to the hospital. So you didn't actually, it's not that the plan didn't work, you followed the plan. So having that attitude about acknowledging that these things do happen, people do get sick, that is not a failure. And even going back into the facility, it means something didn't work, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the individual has failed. So, I just think it's important. You can use that safety planning process to put the person in charge of the situation without having them feel threatened, give them the control over it, and they're able to make decisions. Now, sometimes they may make decisions that end up with them being back in the nursing facility. We all make bad decisions. We have consequences from those. Again, they're not imposed by our center, but that's an opportunity for us to learn as well. All right, moving on to slide 28. What we've got here are some checklists, and I just wanted to give a nod and explain some of what you might be able to access. The Nursing Home Transition Needs Survey, this was developed by Julie Alexander at Independence First. This is a great needs survey. Moving on to slide 29, you can see some sample questions as they relate to housing. What I love about this particular tool that Julie developed is that it's very specific. It asks lots of questions. So this is something that you can use as a model, and that's available in the ABC's transition manual. Moving on to slide 30. This set of worksheets, which we can move over to 31, is a more general guide. So when you're looking at this, I have the sample worksheet related to health. It identifies, actually move to 31, it identifies some specific things like medical supplies, adaptive equipment, does the person have a Medicaid card, health care, and it seems very general, but the difficulty with Medicaid is, and the service systems in our state is, none of them are the same. So we wanted a very general tool that we could use just to give people sort of a tickler file. These are the kinds of things you want to consider and look at. Moving to slide 32, another set of tools that you can look at are out of Michigan. I have to say Michigan rocks. Worked with Ellen Weaver, who's involved in all of this. They have a very strong person-centered planning approach. So when you look at their tools, they're very focused on the person-centered planning process, the team developing the plan. Moving to slide 33, they have a great timeline that they've developed, and this is something that came up on one of the previous sessions. I just wanted to have you all see this. It gives you a sense of the kinds of things that you would need to do at the various stages in the transition from 2 to 3 months prior, 1 month prior. It may be difficult when doing this to know exactly when you're 3 months out. So what's helpful is you can see the order in which things are done. They don't necessarily have to happen at exactly that point, particularly when you're further out. Moving to slide 34, what's nice about these tools out of Michigan is they have post-transition stuff as well. So the day of the move as well as post-transition. And these lists can be reassuring. I think what's important with these kinds of things is, particularly if you're new to this, and that's really where this webinar was focused, is folks who are new to the transition process or learning about it. You may be thinking, I'm not sure that I know what to do. So these lists are a good way to reassure yourself. We've been very specific. Transition people doing this work come in with a variety of experience. We even put together a list of common things that you should have in your kitchen because we had some transition folks who weren't exactly sure how to stock a kitchen. Okay, and are any of these things critical to, you don't want to say, well, they don't have, I don't know, powdered milk, or there's something not in the refrigerator, or we don't have a particular appliance or something. That's not a reason you would not move forward with the transition. It's just, it's meant to be a guide. So if we move to slide 35, I think what I like to suggest to folks is that these materials are meant to be a guide and can help you reassure you that you're covering all your bases. There are different models out there, but they all accomplish the same goal. We're out there to free our people, and that you should feel free to develop your own tools and personalize your own approach or model. The important thing here is that our core values are critical in terms of supporting the individual and making choices, giving them the ability to take control over their life again, but the actual paperwork and the tools, they can be tweaked, and even the approach. You see something very practical coming from Rochester, something more elaborate out of Michigan. Independence First looks like the stuff that Julie's done, much more practical in terms of these are detailed. Find your own. This is something that you can find your own way, and in fact, ultimately you might end up presenting on this one day. Moving to slide 36. Celebration, I think it's helpful to acknowledge important days for the person and, acknowledge those, send a card, a telephone call, particularly on the anniversary that they moved out. This can make a big difference. Ultimately, the message to the individual is, you are important. I just had a conversation with one of my staff who said, our follow-up calls, sometimes people think, why are they calling me? And that can be in any of the, we were talking about a different set of services we offer, but we just follow up and check. And she said, but ultimately, even those who feel annoyed that we're calling and just checking and saying, hey, how's it going? They all know we care. They're important to us. And even the most independent person who gets that call says, I appreciate that. So moving to 37, we can open this up for the final round of questions and answers during this webinar.
There's a question from Barbara Elliott. Barbara, the floor is yours.
You mentioned one time, Bruce, that we don't have to have all the answers and all the solutions. Is there a place or a network, or do we continue to call you or email you and say, I'm stuck, I don't know how to answer this, where do I go from here?
Yeah, Barbara, you feel free. We've had, over the years, we've had folks call with various issues where they were stuck. Sometimes it's helpful just to have someone who's a little bit removed from the situation. I personally have found, there are folks out there who I just sort of brainstormed with. And honestly, either myself, sometimes I'm difficult to reach, but we have folks who do transition work as well, who'd be happy to brainstorm with you. So if there's something that's really urgent and you're concerned that I may not be able to get back to you on time, if you call and ask for me, my assistant, you can just tell that to my assistant, and I'll either get back to you right away, or one of our other folks can get back to you. But it is really, I think there's also, and I'm not sure, we can send out the information later. There's a online resource that Gerald Jones is doing that we can connect you up with, where I know that folks have sent in some questions, and she's blogged out the answers so that people can see, sort of the thinking.
Okay, appreciate that.
Where are you from, Barbara?
From Durango, Colorado, a very rural area, so we have very limited services.
Right, but one of the things that's interesting I'm not sure how it translates in Colorado, but here in New York, in our rural communities, there's a strong social network that can be extraordinarily helpful as well. We were working with a woman who was in a rural part of our state, and the community actually pulled together to get her out of the nursing facility. So it really became, so particularly as her institutionalization approached the holidays, the fact that she wasn't at home on Thanksgiving was taken as a community call to action, and they got her home by Christmas.
How did that work?
Actually, it was the center there was very unique. They addressed the problem as a systems issue, and they actually had a DJ from the local radio station talk about the issue while he was on, and ended up having a newspaper story about it. It was really an incredible piece. What was interesting was she was institutionalized. You know, for us in New York, it's upstate, downstate, so she was in an upstate rural area, and she was institutionalized in a facility very close to New York City. So there was this whole sense that she was not only not at home, she was removed from the community. And, you know, her son was a strong supporter in bringing her home and, you know, talked about that. So I think, and, you know, it's been pointed out to me that in rural areas, things are a little more flexible with building code, and you can kind of get away with some stuff that you can't necessarily do in the city. So there are difficulties and benefits on every side of this.
Mm-hmm.
But if you run into specific difficulties, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
The next question comes from Mary Ellen Hassenfoss. Mary Ellen, the floor is yours.
Hi, I have a question. You mentioned several times about the fact of not using the term that you're going to end up back in the nursing facility. But there are many things that I've been experiencing that if an individual doesn't follow through, for example, in taking his medication, that it could be a very real possibility that negative consequences could lead to ending up back in a nursing facility. And I just wish you could go into a little bit more explanation about how to approach that kind of consequence.
Okay. Well, I think the first thing that I would want to do is try to identify why the individual isn't taking the meds. So, you know, and I have to say I came to this realization, you know, this approach very personally because I was non-compliant with my medication. I just didn't like the side effects. I never had the conversation with my doctor. So I just took them very sporadically, and it became much more sporadic until a point the doctor sent me a letter that I had clearly understood as being, although addressed to me, it was for his insurance company. It said, if you continue to do this, this is what's going to happen to you. So we had a heart-to-heart conversation, and he said, why are you, you know, I said, okay, it's serious, I understand that. I could die. But, you know, I hate these meds. And I talked explicitly with him about the issues that I was having, and he said, well, we'll just change them. Now, maybe that's not always a possibility, but to try to sort through. Is it that the person doesn't remember? Is it that they don't like the side effects? We tend to do things for a reason, and I think opening the conversation up is the first place to start. And then looking at, you know, potential, you know, we laid out, there have been folks who do who, for whatever reason, they don't want to take a medication or they don't want to pursue a form of treatment, they do have the right to refuse medical treatment. So that is something, and we have had conversations with folks that if you don't do this, the consequence is actually you're going to die. And they said, I understand. This is my choice. So navigating that with folks is an important piece. But, you know, you really have to sort of lay out, these are the, you know, why are you making sure that you ask the person, why are you doing this? And maybe they don't even know. You know, for me, I'm sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was just saying, for this specific individual, it's a mental health illness, and he doesn't take his medication because he likes when he's feeling well, and when he's feeling well, he feels like he doesn't need to take his medication.
Okay.
So we're trying to trying to get him to understand that there's a negative consequence, that even if he feels well, there's going to be another emotion that comes with the feeling good.
Right. Well, and I think particularly with this particular issue, I think peer support is extraordinarily helpful, because I can say to someone, I can talk very clearly about the diabetes meds and what the impact is. The positive feeling you have when you're sliding into manic state is not something I can actually address as well as someone who's been there. And you can have, if you have a peer support program that you can connect the person up with, where someone can actually, empathize and say, look, I understand you're feeling really good, but this is what's going to happen soon. That would be something. And I think another piece is to sort of allow the person to understand that this is what's happening. So having those conversations about these are the potential consequences that will happen down the line. Not so much you're going to end up in a nursing facility, but, you're going to do these kinds of things and it's going to be, disruptive to your life. Having that up front so that the person can begin to connect those together, because I don't know that people do that. And then just, again, I think it's important to allow the person to sort of to build those connections in their head and see what happened and be there to support them. So, and tying it back. So suddenly something's happened, there's been a mental hygiene arrest or what have you, you can tie it back and say, okay, this is where the process began here, but I think that a peer is really the best person to do this.
Okay, thank you.
Martha Mason, Martha, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to make a comment. I understand that we need to counsel people about the results of their actions as far as taking meds go. I also understand that I have the right to live my life or not live my life the way I choose. The thing that I've been told in New Mexico when I was taking people out of nursing homes there was that if you go against doctors' advice, Medicaid can cut you off. Do you know if that's true?
Okay, so how you get discharged is an important process. So you can actually leave a facility AMA against medical advice.
Right.
And then what you've done is you're right. We've had some folks who've advocated that, well, just leave. But then your AMA and getting access to services is difficult. They don't actually have complete control over your life. So I think once it, and we had a transition that we had worked for months on, and the facility noted it in their records as against medical advice, even though they were at, a bunch of meetings on the transition.
All the way along.
Right. So, we had a meeting to discuss that after the fact. But, what we found is, in that case, we needed to come up with, the gentleman needed nursing services. And we needed to work out, a solution for that. And some of them are a little less elegant. So in this case, one of our staff, who was just, she wasn't a nurse, but she'd been trained by the nurse, did some essentially informal support, and she said, look, he had an issue with the pressure source. She said, hey, I'm going to get very familiar with your ass. Do you, I suppose it's turnabout's fair play. Do you want to look at mine? And he laughed and he said, oh, no.
No, thank you. So I guess what it comes down to then is that if Medicaid drops them, then that gets rid of a whole lot of regulations, and it's easier to provide services.
Well, it can be. In this case, he had personal assistance. Because he was AMA, he had personal assistance services that were in place. We just couldn't get this other thing. So that was, they classified it as AMA, but we had put the other services and supports in place. I think that if a person leaves AMA, there are some things that you can do around adult protective services, but you want to work with the individual very, very closely.
Okay.
And maybe a person's left AMA because they were assaulted or there was some issue there. You need to address that, and that may be some education on the part of the folks who are coming in to do, good by the person.
Okay. But the AMA is basically, as far as leaving the institution itself, it doesn't have anything to do with after I'm out, I decide I don't want to take my meds, or I'm going to...
Your physician can drop you. Your physician can refuse to provide services for you, but I don't think that there is a requirement that you have to take your meds to qualify. There may be some issues around addiction where you can lose services. So we've worked with some folks where if they weren't in treatment, they weren't going to be eligible for Medicaid.
Right.
So that is a slightly different piece, but I think that some of what we've seen is that's used as a threat against people to try to get compliance. And I think what you want to do is find out what the person values and see how this aligns with that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, next question comes from Barbara Elliott. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm struggling with being patient with the system and waiting for referrals because I understand that I really cannot go in and talk to residents and ask them if they want to leave. I really need to wait for referrals. I'm very new to this position, and so I'm struggling with it.
Okay, well, some of the things that you want to look at is the nursing facilities are required now to give referrals to folks who say yes to want to leave a nursing facility under the minimum data set.
Mm-hmm.
So reaching out to the facilities to say, if you have folks who say yes to Q1A and they want to move out, you can refer them here. Also, one of the things that we found very successful was, just in the first webinar we talked about ways of outreach. Finding one person in a facility allows you entrance into that facility, and you can talk to folks as you come and go. I think one of the things that was really effective was we had a woman who we were working with who, once we started doing this work, as she walked through, she said, if someone caught my eye as I was walking through the facility, I would ask them, do you want to leave? Do you want to get out? and honestly, and she could do this. So it was a very, it was a great way to evaluate. This person caught my eye and looked at me, so clearly there's some interaction here, and it was a first step. And once you're connected to that individual, the facility can't tell you can't come in.
Okay.
Again, you're going to want to navigate that in a very careful way, because if you don't want to, my point is you want to work with the facility so that you can continue to work with other people, but not let the facility get out of bounds and do things that that are really wrong and illegal.
Mm-hmm. Well, for us in the rural area, I understand I was supposed to go to the health department with that system to the single entry point and get referrals from them, that the facility was to contact them, and then if they needed my services, then the single entry point would contact me. I do have a pretty good rapport with the administrator at the facility, and he has been very gracious in saying I can come in any time. So to make contact with the residents would be a very easy thing for me to do. However, I thought I was supposed to always wait for the single entry point to refer those residents to me after the person was contacted through social services.
Right, and I don't think you have to do that. And honestly, you can go. My point is, I want to make sure what we're trying to do is build relationships for the long term.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like you're doing that. But you can ask folks. You don't have to wait though for referrals. Now, I'll put a caveat on that. If you're working on a grant that has a specific funding stream, and I don't know your specific situation, that would be something you'd want to clarify with where you work. Mm-hmm. But, for example, we have a project where we're funded to work with the folks who said yes to Q1A. So people who aren't on that list aren't covered by the funding stream. So we're not supposed to report those, but that doesn't mean we don't talk to them.
Okay.
They just don't get reported in that funding stream.
I understand this was through Medicaid, and Medicaid was paying for the services, so I needed to follow the process.
Okay, and honestly, the individual has a right in a nursing facility to talk to people who are providing services to them. Mm-hmm. So what I say is when you're going through, and you can do this in a variety of ways, whether we've done stuff where we've gone in, had social stuff during the holidays, done caroling, and included information about getting out as a part of that, because the rec people were looking for something. We've done stuff with facilities where they've posted information about us and allowed us to hang out and talk to folks. I think it's a matter of sort of exploring with the facility what works, and I think if they're not sure what the value is, one of the things that you can do is help them transition out folks who are on Medicaid, where their reimbursement is relatively low, which allows them to flip that bed into a Medicare rehab bed, and they make more money.
Okay, thank you.
The next question comes from Keith Percy. Keith, the floor is yours.
Yes, I have a consumer that I'm working with, and I noticed that when I work with them, they're very fierce and very in control and very ready to say what they need and what they want and where they are. But then when I'm reaching out and working with the nursing home staff and, complying with those parts of the process, they'll defer to, whoever's talking around that table and whoever the authority is. And I'm just worried that, they might get out and, be confronted with a lot more authority and feel less in control. And I wondered if you might give additional tips for how to work on that.
Well, I think exploring some of that with the individual during the transition process and looking at how they can be address their self-advocacy needs. So I think being upfront about that and helping, and maybe it's a matter of just sort of taking it in small steps. You might identify something where the individual wants to do something where the facility says, where someone has said no or the person's deferred at the meeting. Then sort of, go through that with the individual, sort through where the person might have a difference of opinion from the facility staff, do role play, try to break down the issue, and then, at the next meeting, see if you can get the individual can bring that up and sort of address that small piece at the next transition meeting. Or it may be just even too intimidating to do that in front of a group. You could set up something where the individual is talking to that person in authority separate with the three of you together, sort of balancing the power structure, the dynamics out a bit. And if the person can see that their opinion can be valued and supported by those in authority, that it's not necessarily that the authority, people in authority are right and they're wrong, that might be a good first step. But I would really definitely focus on that as part of the process. And sometimes it's easier, oddly, to advocate on things that are not in your own personal life. So getting the person involved in some advocacy that you're doing as a center might help build some of those skills separate from their own individual issues.
Those are all very good, and I especially like the one about maybe talking with one of the people around the table with the three of us there, because that balances out the advocacy piece, and they might see that they have some backup, and like you said, they might see that it's not necessarily a right and wrong issue. So
right.
Those are good starts.
Cool. Good luck.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I've been a little bit silent because we haven't had any questions rolling in. Bruce, you referenced the blog that Daryl Jones has created, and that is at 21centurycil.org. That's 21centurycil.org. And when you go there, there's several blogs from the folks at ILRU. Daryl's is at silcommunityalternatives.org. So if you go there and click the link for silcommunityalternatives.org, you'll see that there. So I just wanted to announce that.
Okay, the next question comes from Barbara Elliott. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Tim, I want to ask you again what your email address is and how to get a hold of the ABC manual and the cost of it.
Sure. Well, the good news is the cost of it is absolutely free. It's online on a public website. And the way to get a hold of me is my email address is Tim at NCIL, as in National Council Independent Living, .org.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, and I just had another question roll in. We've got some time, so I'll go ahead and take it. Bruce, Debbie Turnbow asks, how long do you see the consumer after they come out of the nursing home?
We can actually end up working with someone long term. So it really depends on the individual, and it may not be continuous contact. So we've had individuals who've transitioned out of a nursing facility. We actually provide Medicaid service coordination to as a part of the waiver services, and we have ongoing, very regular contact with them. We have those who actually, who don't necessarily fall into that system, who just needed some support up front, and we just touch base with them periodically, until things are stable, and that's going to vary from person to person. Some folks have just been a few contacts across, 6 months, and then, just a call at a year just to say, hey, congratulations. And then there are those who, we're not that much working with them, but they call periodically when there's an issue. We're very clear up front that if you have any issue where that we can help you with, we explain the full breadth of things that we do. So problems with benefits, housing, or services, you need advocacy, you want someone in your corner, just give us a call. So it varies, again, very much by person and what their situation and their needs are.
Okay, thanks so much. Well, I'm going to click to slide 38 here, and again, Bruce has been generous enough to offer his contact information. And then I'll click to slide 39, and this is the evaluation form for Part 4 here. So again, we've had a different evaluation for each call, and if you would, please do fill that out. If you're on the webinar, you can click on that. It's a live link. And as always, if you're participating in a group, feel free to discuss it and fill it out together. But please do make sure to give us your feedback. And with that, that is the end of today's call and our series. Bruce, I want to give you a tremendous thanks and round of applause for a job well done. And I want to thank all of you for being with us through these 4 series. As with all of these calls, they're going to be archived on ILRU's webpage. So today's will be up within 48 hours. The others are already up. And so you or any of your colleagues can access these in real time and participate with them in them. You can read through the transcript and take notes from it, or you can watch the webinar as it happened with the PowerPoints. So, Bruce, thanks once again. It's been a pleasure. To all of you,